Welcome once again to Tarikamba. I'm your host, Solomon Kibriye. In the previous episode, we discussed the fall of the Zagwe dynasty and the restoration of the Solomonic dynasty under Emperor Yukuno Amlak in the year 1270. As we discussed, Yukuno Amlak reigned until his death in 1285. Yukuno Amlak had arranged for his son, Yagbe-Seyon, or Agba-Seyon, to be crowned as co-monarch in the last years of his reign. So at the moment of his father's death on June 19, 1285, Emperor Yagbe-Seyon became the sole emperor and king of kings of Ethiopia. His name, Yagbe-Seyon, means "May he enter Zion." While the Ethiopian chronicles of the emperors from this period are scant on the details of the reigns of the early Restoration monarchs, we can glean some information from foreign sources. Firstly, we know that Yagbe-Seyon took the additional throne name of Solomon I. Clearly, he took this name to underline his claimed heritage dating back to the biblical house of David. It also appears that Yagbe-Seyon ended his father's confrontational attitude towards his Muslim vassals and neighbors and began friendlier relations with all of them. These friendlier relations with the Muslim world led to an improvement of his relations with the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Al-Mansur Alawun. In the first year of his reign as full sovereign, Yagbe-Seyon sent letters to Sultan Alawun and the Coptic Patriarch Johannes VII, renewing his father's unsuccessful pleas for the appointment of a new bishop for Ethiopia. This time, however, Sultan Alawun was far friendlier than Sultan Baybars had been towards Yagbe-Seyon's father, and so he urged Johannes VII to appoint a new bishop for Ethiopia without delay. Of course, obtaining a bishop was not achieved simply by sending a request. For centuries, Ethiopian monarchs would send vast amounts of treasure to both the rulers of Egypt and to the Coptic patriarchs to obtain the bishops they so desperately needed. Large quantities of gold, ivory, incense, and exotic animals would be sent to both the secular leaders of Egypt as well as to the patriarch to produce a new bishop. It would be a burden that increased resentment on the part of Ethiopia towards Egypt and the leadership of the Coptic Church over the centuries. But finally, the Coptic Pope appointed an Egyptian monk as Bishop of Ethiopia and sent him to his diocese. It had been 30 years since the death of Abuna Kerolos, the previous Coptic bishop, and so he was received with great joy and relief by the emperor and his people. There is disagreement on the name of this bishop. Some sources say he was named Abuna Salama II and say he was named after Ethiopia's first bishop because after not having a canonical bishop to ordain new priests or deacons for 3 decades, he would virtually need to refound the church from scratch, like the first bishop. However, both the Gedle Tekle Haymanot and the official chronology maintained by the Coptic Orthodox Church named this new bishop as Abuna Johannes II. Abba Tekle Haymanot had been serving as locum tenens, or acting bishop, during the interim, and upon the arrival of Abuna Johannes, handed over the office and returned to his monastery at Debre Atzmo, the future Debre Libanos. The new bishop, Abuna Johannes II, had a great reverence for the aging Tekle Haymanot and asked him to accept appointment in an episcopal capacity over a portion of the empire serving under him, but Abba Tekle Haymanot declined the honor. Tekle Tzaddik Mokre writes that Yagbe-Seyon planned a pilgrimage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem in order to pay homage to the tomb of Christ, but that domestic political considerations made him drop his plans. Famed explorer Marco Polo mentions that one of the princes of Ethiopia planned in 1288 to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem following the practice of a number of his subjects. He was dissuaded from this project, but sent his bishop in his place. On his return leg, this bishop was detained by the Sultan of Aden, who attempted to convert the bishop to Islam. When the cleric steadfastly refused to do so, the Sultan then had the bishop forcibly circumcised before releasing him. It is not known if this bishop was the Coptic Abuna Johannes although it seems it was indeed him and not some other high-ranking Ethiopian cleric mistaken as a bishop, as some have supposed. One can surmise that because both Ethiopian Christians and Muslims practiced male circumcision, the Copts did not. Marco Polo states that the Ethiopian monarch then marched upon Aden, and despite support from 2 other Muslim allies, the Sultan was defeated and his capital captured. A number of historians, including J. Spencer Trimmingham and Richard Pankhurst, identify this ruler as Yagbe-Seyon. It indicates that Ethiopia had recovered sufficient military strength in the post-Zagwe period to assert itself across the Red Sea, albeit temporarily. Little else is known about the reign of Yagbe-Seyon. We do know that in thanks for his victory against a certain Yikabana, he gave an illuminated set of Gospels to the Haik Stephanos monastery. He had the Gospels inscribed with the statement, "I, Yagbe-Seyon, whose regnal name is Solomon, adorned this book of the 4 Gospels and gave it to St. Stephen. From there came Yagabana, who wanted to take away my throne, but I defeated him and destroyed him with the power of Christ, my God." Who this rebellious Yagabana was is not known. He could have been a Zagwe claimant or a rival of another background. It's a matter of speculation, as there's no other reference to him to be found. This claimant must have posed a significant threat, though, to inspire this gift of thanks. There is a 15th century Western illustration of the emperor and his army fighting the Sultan of Adal and his men in Le Livre Mauvais. The relations between Yagbe-Seyon and the subsidiary vassals, sultanates that owed him tribute, were generally good, so perhaps this is a misidentified image and the war with the ruler of Aden is what's being depicted. At the time of Yagbe-Seyon, Adal had not yet emerged from its predecessor Ifat Sultanate. Certainly by the 15th century, the Adal Sultanate was a big challenger to the Ethiopian Empire, but not in the 13th. With his pilgrimage to Jerusalem thwarted, Yagbe-Seyon instead sent a large gift of precious draperies, tapers, and incense to the Ethiopian monks at the Holy Sepulchre, along with a letter asking them to remember him in their prayers. Emperor Yagbe-Seyon died in 1294 after a reign of 9 years. Upon the death of Yagbe-Seyon, there followed a period of some confusion. He was immediately succeeded by his son Sinfa Arad IV. This emperor only reigned a year. In fact, he was succeeded in quick succession by Hizbasgid, then Qedmasgid, then Janasgid, then Sebas-Asgid, each of whom reigned for 1 year. Some accounts say that Yagbe-Seyon could not decide which of his 5 sons to designate as heir, and so he ordered that each reign for a year as a type of trial for each. However, there is disagreement about whether all 5 were indeed his sons, with certain historians like James Bruce and Antoine Dabadi claiming that these were all sons of Yukono Amlak and brothers of Yagbe-Seyon, while the Gedle Betzalota Mikhail states only Qedmasgid was a brother to Yagbe-Seyon and the others his sons. Regardless of what their relationship to each other was, Ethiopia had too many living emperors running around trying to get another turn on the throne. According to tradition, it was Janasgid who revived the Aksumite tradition of imprisoning males of the dynasty. He chose Amba Gishen as the royal prison and placed his brothers and his own sons there. Sebas-Asgid managed to get out, though, and claimed his single year on the throne, imprisoning Janasgid. These 5 monarchs reigned between 1294 and 1299. This tumultuous situation was ended by their uncle, Wedem Arad, brother of Yagbe-Seyon and son of Yukono Amlak, who seized power and was crowned emperor in 1299. According to Teclis Adik Mokrea, Emperor Wedem Arad ordered that a chronicle of his reign be written, but that it either never got carried out or it hasn't survived. Thus, details of his reign are scant from Ethiopian sources. What is known is that early in his reign, according to Taddisa Tamurat, he confronted a rebel force assembled by a Sheikh Abu Abdullah. but that a negotiated peace was arranged. Taddessa Tamurat believes that the settlement included a significant land grant and identifies the district known as Abdallah in Shah as the possible location of this land grant. Another significant act of Wedem Arad's reign was the sending of an embassy of 30 envoys to Europe in 1306. Their mission was to establish contacts with the kings of Aragon and Castile, but it is unknown whether they reached their destination or if they returned successfully. What is known is that they did visit both Rome and Avignon and were received at the papal court of Pope Clement V, the pope who moved the seat of the papacy from Rome to Avignon in France, where it would remain for 67 years. There's an interesting side story here. Pope Clement V is famous, jointly with King Philippe IV of France, for the brutal suppression of the Order of the Knights Templar. The order, formerly known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, had been established in Crusader-ruled Jerusalem in 1118, headquartered on the Temple Mount. The palace of this order is today the famous Al-Aqsa Mosque. Although officially a military order of knights pledged to protect the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, the majority of its members were civilians and had long provided hospitality to pilgrims and also conducted a vast financial network thanks to the vast amount of donations they received from rich and poor alike to further their mission. Indeed, they were part of the process in the development of modern banking. Author Graham Hancock, in his rather sensational book about the Ark of the Covenant titled The Sign and the Seal, has alleged that the Zagwe Emperor Lalibela befriended the Templar Knights during his time as an exiled prince in Jerusalem, and that some of these European knights had accompanied him back to Ethiopia in the hopes of being able to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem from Ethiopia. He speculates that a secret message from the Solomonic Emperor of Ethiopia to Pope Clement and King Philippe may have caused the violent suppression of the Order of the Templar Knights in Europe to prevent these erstwhile Zagwe allies from absconding from Ethiopia with the Ark. His theory was that neither the kings of Europe or the papacy wanted this already powerful and rich order to bring this holiest of relics to Europe and rob them of a huge portion of their secular and spiritual powers simply by possessing it. It's a fantastic theory, but no other historian has ever made this connection. It is generally agreed that the suppression of the Templars was more about seizing their vast wealth and allegations of corruption, secret heretical rituals that undermine the Roman Catholic faith, and supposed occult practices. It is possible that the Ethiopian embassy met with the French king as well as Pope Clement, but there is no documentation of such a meeting. The Templars were hunted down and killed. Many were burned at the stake and their vast wealth seized. The elderly Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Mornay, is reported to have cursed both King Philippe IV and Pope Clement V as he was being burned while facing Notre Dame Cathedral, as per his request. He cried out to God that both the king and the pope be called before his throne for divine judgment. Pope Clement was dead within a month, and King Philippe before the end of the year. It is said that after Clement V died in 1314, his body was lying in state in a church when in the middle of the night a powerful thunderstorm arose and lightning struck the church and set it and the Pope's body on fire. Pope Clement V's body was incinerated to the point that it was destroyed. As for the Ethiopian embassy, while it is not known if they ever made it to the Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, it is known that they were delayed on their return journey in Genoa and were interviewed by geographer Giovanni da Carignano. While his interview has been lost, a summary of it by Jacobus Philippus Foresti da Bergamo is included in his Supplementum Chronicarum, the first text to associate the legendary priestly king Prester John with Ethiopia. Far away from these happenings in Europe, Wedem Arad was re-securing the rule of his dynasty after the tumult of the reigns of his 5 nephews. The only other event of note that we know for certain is that in 1313, the giant figure of Ethiopia's Orthodox Church, Abba Tekle Haymanot, died at his monastery of Debre Atzmo, which was later renamed Debre Libanos. The death of this great church father, who would become one of Ethiopia's most venerated saints, must have been a huge milestone to the country, the church, and the imperial dynasty he had done so much to enthrone. Just a year later, in 1314, Emperor Wedem Arad died. He would be succeeded by one of Ethiopia's most consequential monarchs, Emperor Yagbe-Seyon. We will discuss this great monarch in the next episode of Tarikamba. It would be wrong, however, to go into the stories of the next few reigns without a discussion of the legend of Prester John. Prester John, which derives from the Latin Presbyter Johannes, was a legendary Christian priest and king. According to Carol Delaney, accounts popular in Europe from the 12th to the 17th centuries told of a Nestorian patriarch and king who was said to rule over a Christian nation lost amid the pagans and Muslims in the Orient. These accounts were often embellished with various tropes of medieval popular fantasy, depicting Prester John as a descendant of the three wise men who visited the newborn Christ, ruling a wonderfully powerful kingdom full of untold riches, marvels, and strange creatures. The earliest accounts place Prester John in India, and indeed he was sometimes called Prester John of the Indies. Tales of the Nestorian Christians' success in evangelizing Asia and of the Apostle Thomas's subcontinental travels, as documented in works like the Acts of Thomas, probably had a role in the formation of this legend. Indeed, there's an ancient community of Christians in India today that trace their origin to the evangelization by St. Thomas the Apostle. They are also non-Chalcedonian Oriental Orthodox or Tewahedo Christians like the Christians of Ethiopia. We will explain the details of this faith in another episode. However, these churches are not Nestorian and actually regard Nestorianism as a grave heresy. After the exposure of the Western world to the Mongols, accounts moved this legendary priest-king to somewhere in Central Asia. Robert Silverberg connects this account with historic events in 1141 when the Kara Hittite Khanate under Yelu-Dashi defeated the Seljuk Turks in the Battle of Katwan near Samarkand. The Seljuks ruled over Persia at the time and were the most powerful force in the Muslim world. The defeat at Samarkand weakened them substantially. The Kara Hittite at the time were Buddhist, not Christians, and there is no reason to suppose Yelu-Dashi was ever called Prester John. However, several vassals of the Kara Hittite practiced Nestorian Christianity, which may have contributed to the legend. It is also possible that the Europeans, who were unfamiliar with Buddhism and knew little of Asia, assumed that if the leader was not Muslim, he must be Christian. The defeat of the Seljuk Turks sparked hope among the increasingly embattled crusaders and raised hope of deliverance from the east. There were even those that initially thought Genghis Khan was Prester John, but were quickly disabused of that misconception. As stated earlier, it was the Genoan geographer Giovanni da Carignano who interviewed Emperor Wedem Arad's envoys and concluded that these envoys of a Christian state in Africa must in fact be the representatives of the fabled Prester John. Thus was born the identification of the Emperor of Ethiopia as Prester John. Prester John had long been considered the ruler of India since the legend's beginnings, but India was a vague concept to medieval Europeans. Writers often spoke of the three Indias, and lacking any real knowledge of the Indian Ocean, they sometimes considered Ethiopia one of the three Indias. Indeed, even going back to classical time, there was the concept that everything east of the Nile was Asia, so Ethiopia was one of the three Indias to people of Europe. Westerners knew that Ethiopia was a powerful Christian nation, but contact had been sporadic since the rise of Islam. When Prester John failed to turn up in Asia, European imagination moved him around blurry frontiers of what they considered India, until they found him in an appropriately powerful kingdom called Ethiopia. Marco Polo had discussed Ethiopia as a magnificent Christian land, and Eastern Orthodox Christians had a legend that this nation would one day rise up and invade Arabia, taking it back after having lost its Arabian possessions in the late Aksumite period. Then, in 1306, the 30 Ethiopian ambassadors from Emperor Wedem Arad came to Europe, and when they mentioned that the patriarch of their church was named John, people like Giovanni da Carignano jumped to the conclusion that this was indeed the fabled Prester John. Of course, they were talking about the patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church, who at that time was Pope Johannes VIII, who reigned from February 14, 1300 to May 29, 1320. The Emperor of Ethiopia was not named Johannes at the time, but Wedem Arad. Another description of an African Prester John is in the Mirabilia Descripta of the Dominican missionary Jordanus, written around 1329, who was clearly influenced by Carignano. In discussing the Third India, Jordanus records a number of fanciful stories about the land and its king, whom he says Europeans call Prester John. The idea of Ethiopia as the land of Prester John persisted into the 1500s. By then, because the legend of this priest king had lasted for centuries and was way beyond the lifespan of normal humans, the term Prester John became something of a title that Europeans would use for the Emperor of Ethiopia. When ambassadors from Emperor Zara-Yacob attended the Council of Florence in 1441, they were astonished and confused when council prelates insisted on referring to their monarch as Prester John. They attempted to explain that nowhere in Zara-Yacob's list of regnal names did the title Prester John occur. However, their attempts did not manage to stop Europeans from calling the Emperor of Ethiopia Prester John. Much later, the Czech Franciscan Remedios Prudký asked Emperor Iyasu II about Ethiopian monarchs being called Prester John in 1751. Prudký states that the emperor was astonished and told me that the kings of Abyssinia had never been accustomed to call themselves by this name. Richard Pankhurst states that this is apparently the first recorded statement by an Ethiopian monarch about this tale, and that Ethiopian monarchs were likely unaware of the title until Prudky's question to Iyasu II. 17th century academics like German Hiob Ludolf came to the conclusion that there was no actual connection between the fabled Prester John and any of the very real Ethiopian monarchs. The search for the legendary priest king gradually ceased, but the legend had affected several hundred years of European and world history, directly and indirectly, by encouraging Europe's explorers, missionaries, scholars, and treasure hunters. These tales of hidden treasure and untold riches would not only be a catalyst for these adventurers, but would help plant the seed that became European colonialism in Africa. This has been Solomon Kibriye with Tarikamba. Join us for the next episode about Emperor Yagbe-Seyon, one of Ethiopia's most significant rulers. Please remember to send any questions or comments to me via email at solomon@tarikamba.com. Visit our website at www.tarikamba.com. Follow Tarikamba on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And please subscribe to our YouTube page and like our videos. Until next time, be well.